following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
Welcome to the GRTiQ podcast. This is part 2 of our 2-part look back on the guests that shaped the ideas and stories told on the GRTiQ podcast in 2022. During this episode, you'll hear excerpts from episodes 73 through 95. We'll be back with a new episode of the podcast next week, the first episode of 2023, to start the new year. Until then, please enjoy listening to part 2 of the very best of 2022.
Episode 73.
From episode 73, here's Ahmad Mardeni, a well-known voice within the graph ecosystem, talking about what it was about the graph that drew him into the community.
Decentralizing the most important layer in Web3, which is data, is really important. And making data accessible to all the apps is super important, because after the graph, now dApps don't need to hire a team or waste their resources on building hardware and software to query the blockchain. The graph made it really easy for developers to just query the data they need from the blockchain and start working on their ideas. So before the graph, there were a lot of ideas that impossible to build, because querying the right data from the blockchain is really hard. And after the graph, we are seeing a lot of really interesting dApps utilizing the graph to bring their ideas to life.
Episode 74.
And now Ahmet Ozcan, co-founder and CEO at Semiotic Labs, sharing his incredible vision for the future of the graph during episode 74.
Well, first of all, I think the amount of blockchain data currently, or even non-blockchain like IPFS, is so little. People forget that we are at the early stages of this new decentralized internet. So Web3 will be huge. So when Yaniv, the CEO of Edge & Node, speaks like indexing the world's public data, he has this, I think, grand vision that there will be a lot of data. Just like imagine the early days of the internet, maybe indexing the web wasn't a very difficult task in these early days, but then it became really an insurmountable task. So we're going to see that exponential growth in terms of the data, maybe number of blockchains or the type of data that will be on the blockchain. And at that point, I think the value of the graph will be crystal clear to everybody. That's for just the query and indexing Web3. And beyond that, as I mentioned, Graph as a platform will grow beyond its core mission, this query layer, and there will be new types of applications on the Graph, new types of businesses, new ideas building on the Graph. So I'm really excited about that grand vision as well. And I think just like, as I gave you an example, the Google has a huge AI team. They have even acquired companies like DeepMind. They have thousands of AI researchers because AI is infused in all of Google's products. So I envision that Semiotic Labs will one day grow to hundreds of AI researchers, even maybe thousands, and infuse AI everywhere in Web3 through Graph. Because Web3, if you think about it, is all about machine-to-machine interactions and executions. So that is really ripe for automation and especially AI applications to enable very efficient execution and transactions on Web3. So I'm really excited about that future. And it's hard to see it because we are at such early stages. People have, I think, difficulty to understand the scale of things where we will end up. But you can always look at Web 2 and the evolution of Web 2 and I think come to the same conclusion.
Episode 75.
During episode 75, we featured Joel Chen and Rob Haysfield. Here, Rob talks about their research and how it led to a grant from the Graph Foundation.
Well, at the time, I had been pretty vocal about how I use different tools for thought and what I thought about them and what I thought about their design. I had a YouTube channel where I'd make videos about it and all of that. So like, and really, I just am a connoisseur of this space. I really try to explore it all and understand as much of like the landscape as I can. So, at one point after I had posted one of my more popular threads on the subject, he reached out to me and said, "Hey, can I support your research?" At first I thought to myself, what research? I just use these tools because like really like that was a big part of why I had talked about this stuff was because, like in my consulting agreements, I wasn't able to talk about these things publicly. Like I wasn't able to talk about my specific work publicly, but like I could talk about like the meta work of how I was doing it. So that's what I talked about. And eventually I realized, well, actually I am doing research. It's just informal and maybe I could make it more formal. And then in doing so, answer more interesting questions. Right. And I also knew like vaguely that Edge and Node was working on some sort of thing in the space of what Yaniv asked me to research. But I had no idea. Yaniv reached out to me about me doing research and like I was just thinking about like, okay, how do I apply for this grant? Like, what am I asking for? And I realized that I needed Joel to work with me on it because for me, one of the things I'm really good at is I'm good at this like sort of pathfinding. Like I'm a very good explorer of the space, and very good at like intuitively figuring out what are the most important questions to answer. What are some things we can accept as true and base further research on? But Joel, like he's published more than 40 papers at this point, and many of them are on interesting ideas and how software can support better thinking. I knew that I needed his background to be able to support like and actually like ground my exploration in the prior art. So that's when I reached out to Joel. I was like, hey, are you looking for a new research subject? Because I've got one.
Episode 76.
From episode 76, here's Derek Meyer, Graph Advocate, member of Graph Advocates DAO, and founder of the indexer Data Nexus. Here, Derek shares the backstory of how he started his side hustle as a subgraph developer early on as he was becoming more active within the graph ecosystem.
Absolutely. And I would go so far, just to, I guess, humble myself a little bit. I went out there not knowing how to develop subgraphs. I could read TypeScript, but like, mind you, I come from a database background. I didn't do any JavaScript, any TypeScript, let alone assembly script, which is, what subgraphs are written in. So I didn't do any of that. Now I could read through it and, make sense of what the code was trying to say. But if you sat me down at a computer, I couldn't type anything. And so I'm definitely someone who likes to learn by doing. And I just kind of throw myself into some difficult situations and I figure my way out. And I've always found that I learn really quickly when I do those types of things. And so I wasn't necessarily looking for an opportunity where I was going to say, hey, do you want a subgraph? I'm going to go build it by myself. But, and I was willing to do that, but I'd probably rely pretty heavily on the Graph Discord channels. But this was a perfect opportunity of someone who was a web developer and knows JavaScript and TypeScript. And he was like, great, I can help on this aspect. I don't know anything about the graph protocol and how it works, or I'll need some help figuring out how our data should be structured and organized, which that I definitely had experience with. And so the two of us kind of complemented each other really well. And that was my goal, is I wanted to throw myself into situations where I had no clue what to do. And, being forced to figure them out and ask questions to a lot of people. And I think back to those days and I was just constantly, asking questions to various people. I know Slim Chance has probably lost a lot of hours of sleep just with me, constantly pinging him and all of that. But the whole experience, it ended with me being able to understand all aspects of how a subgraph is comprised, how to put it together, what things to check for. And not that I've run into all possible scenarios, but I've definitely learned enough to where I feel comfortable building a subgraph from here out. And so it was definitely an interesting time period. And but I would say more than anything, I really enjoyed it. I was working probably 60 hours a week with my other job, coming home to my family and all of that, doing family time. And then after they all went to sleep, I started working on this because it was enjoyable. I got to watch data start to become organized, and something that used to be a big, hodgepodge, trying to find the information that you're looking for. It was like a needle in a haystack. And so watching this compartmentalize into the ways that you want it to, every time it's a magical feeling seeing it do the things that you want it to do.
Episode 77.
During episode 77, we met with Alejandro Mercado with Bit Refill. Here, Alejandro talks about the impact of crypto in his home country of Venezuela.
Yeah, well, let's go back a little bit in history. In Venezuela, I grew up in the 90s, and in the 90s, we had 30% inflation every year in Venezuela. You think 10% is bad in the US now, but imagine having 30% year over year over year over year. Of course, if you were part of the middle class, which we thankfully were, because my grandfather did a lot of work to ensure that was the case. He was the first one in the family to go to college. And, he came from a dirt floor house and, very, very limited education, but really good values family. And my grandfather, grandmother, they met in college. They both were the first that went to college, and they gave the family future, right? So then my dad went to college and I went to college, and we were lucky enough to be able to get US visas to visit, right? And because we were able to prove that we didn't really want to stay in the US. We had a beautiful country. We used to be, in the 70s, I think the 5th economy in the world. And, certainly of Latin America, the most desirable country to live in by far. And, we were happy. Like we had a great country that had a lot of inequality, like the US has inequality today, maybe higher than what the US has today, but still similar problem. And it ended up going south for various reasons that, I don't know if we're going to be able to get into all of that. But I think it's important to mention that, we had high inflation and we were primed to think about our options to save money, right? And one of the options to save money was, of course, to start to buy property. And if you didn't have enough money to buy property, but you were able to have, a US visa, or someone that you knew had a US visa and could travel to the US, you could go and open an account in the US, or you could go to a Caribbean island that uses the US dollar and just open an account there. And you're instantly transformed to a world of better financial stability, where the Bolivar is no longer the rule that you have to follow, but you can just open the account and keep your money in dollars, in US dollars. And so that's, something that we were grateful. We're grateful, and we were lucky to have that option available to us. So I think that's also informed, my desire to bring that kind of power to everyone in the world. I think it's insane that in 2022, people can't choose the currency that they want to save in.
Episode 78.
Here's Zhen Xiao from episode 78 with Republic, talking about why she became interested in the graph.
So basically, it's really about the efficiency when it comes to the data, right? The accuracy. And graphs, in my opinion, is pretty much this decentralized gatekeeper, this loving community that providing better technical insights into whoever are the developer out there.
Episode 80.
During episode 80, I spoke with Ryan Selkis, founder and CEO, and Vincent Wen, engineering manager at Masari. Here, Ryan shares the backstory for how Masari became the first core subgraph developer within the graph ecosystem.
Well, the short story is I've known Yaniv since 2018, the last bear market. We actually spent a little bit of time together in Berlin around the ETH Berlin conference back during the last bear market. And we spent a couple hours together at dinner. I knew that what he was working on was crazy ambitious. And if it was successful, it was going to be a pretty interesting protocol and bit of infrastructure to actually access these decentralized protocols and get critical information about these decentralized ecosystems. At the time, we were more focused on aggregating kind of global information about the top assets. And we had a combination of research analysts, kind of market data feeds, on-chain data feeds, and just pulling from a number of third-party APIs to give people a good holistic look at the kind of overall health and status of a given project. So we were kind of going broad. The graph was going deep, but we stayed in touch and kind of keenly watched the development of the protocol over the years. When we got together internally and started thinking about seriously producing on-chain analytics and building more of our own on-chain data capabilities in-house late last year, the graph was the first part that came to mind, given the historical relationship. And so I reached out to Yaniv and Tegan and Ava and basically said, hey, we're excited to dig in here. I think there's a lot of work that we can do as an open source developer of subgraphs. We can help with standard setting. We can help with building a lot of this kind of core infrastructure and almost be like a power user of the subgraphs in terms of like a front end for some of these subgraphs and show people what can be possible if they were kind of running their data applications for their protocols and financial products using subgraphs and the graph protocol. And then fast forward 6 months, we became the first front end core developer, subgraph core developer, working on standard setting, developing common taxonomies and high quality like QA process around subgraphs, so that users of these subgraphs have a good bit of reliability baked in when they're leveraging the system. They know kind of who the subgraph developer was. They know that these subgraphs are being well maintained. They're being upgraded when they're new protocol level developments. And because we're kind of a power user and we're dogfooding our own product, that I think was pretty valuable to the community, and ultimately will ensure that more people are building on top of and auditing the technical work that our team is doing.
And now from the same episode, Vincent Wen, talking about how important the graph is for Web3.
So the way I see the graph is that it's essentially Web3's API, or the API to blockchain. I mean, we do have like native JSON RPC API on the blockchain node, but like you cannot pull a lot of data from that. And I think the graph really fills that missing gap in order for people to retrieve not only meaningful data, but they retrieve the data in a really good way to power their use cases, to power their applications, to power their dashboards. And honestly, there are not that many players in the space that's providing this capability. And the graph is the only decentralized one that's doing that. I think this will be especially important after EIP 4.4, where a lot of the historical data will be removed from the native Ethereum client, in which case the graph will essentially be the best source for anyone to access historical data and access the data in a verifiable way, which is something that you are just not getting from any of the centralized players out there. And the really interesting piece that makes all of this work is the well-designed tokenomics of the graph, that there is the kind of interplay between the indexers, the curators, the delegators, the subgraph developers that put this thing all together and make it run smoothly. And I think that in itself is a very good innovation for the space.
The GRTiQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTiQ. In just a few weeks, the GRTiQ podcast will celebrate the release of its 100th episode. We're working hard to make sure that the 100th episode is something very special, and you're going to love it. And it's a huge milestone for us, so we want to celebrate it with those who made it possible. You and all the other listeners who tune in each week to meet the people and hear the stories of those helping to build Web3 and the graph. Listeners who visit grtiq.com/100 that's /100, can record and upload a message that we'll play during the 100th episode celebration. This is our chance to shine a light on you and your story. So if you have something to share about how this podcast or one of the guest stories has impacted you, then we'd love to hear from you. Simply visit grtiq.com/100, that's grtiq.com/100, and upload your message today. Not only will we feature your message during the 100th episode, but you'll also receive a special PO-op. So upload your message today. Visit grtiq.com/100, that's 100, and upload your message today. Let's hear your story and share it with the world.
Episode 81.
From episode 81, Chika Uwaze, co-founder of Afropolitan, talking about some observations she's made about the graph community in Africa.
Yeah. So again, I think we talked about this where we're saying, okay, what is Web3 bringing to the space? What are the new models and the new business opportunities that is happening? So I love what Index Africa is doing, because a lot of people are saying, well, how do we fund philanthropy? How do we make it sustainable? How do we make it ongoing? And how do we get people to be buying in, to this, especially because it can be a thankless model sometimes, right? And so I love what Index Africa is doing, where they basically have a node and everything that is coming to that node is actually being funded back into the education of the students, right? And so again, I see it like as this circle or this community building. And if anything, the more people are building on the graph, and, again, like you said, there's a lot of people in Nigeria and other parts of Africa are doing it, the more they can fund it versus us having to rely on, aid. That's all Africa has been relying on. But how can we make it self-sustaining? So I really love, that model. I'm even asking myself, how can Afropolitan tap into something like that as well? And I actually think it's something that I personally didn't even know this was happening. And so I would love more people to understand like how people can use the graph to do these type of things, right? Public goods, right? A lot of people have been talking about it. When I was a technical recruiter at Protocol Labs, I actually was part of network good, right? And so this is probably something that they even would want to know about, how they can use graphic for, public goods.
Episode 82.
During episode 82, we were joined by Ronil Rumberg, co-founder and CEO at Audius. Here, Ronil talked about how important the graph is for dApps like Audius building in Web3.
Yeah, it's it's a tool, just like all the other tools that that we get to build with. It turns out in this case there really aren't viable alternatives to what the graph does other than build your own indexer, right? And that's a lot of technical debt and baggage to take on, right? If Audius were starting today and didn't already have the the legacy and the debt that it does, I don't think we would have our own indexer, right? In today's world, I don't think it makes sense to own that yourself. Yeah, so what the graph is really, really useful for is being able to answer structured questions about data that exists on chain or in metadata blobs, right? Like you can index metadata that's pinned on IPFS, for example, like in our case. So, all of that is kind of, it serves a very specific and very valuable purpose, right? Which is you can have your users writing all this stuff on chain. But here's another way of describing the benefit is this Audius dashboard that I mentioned pulls all kinds of different on-chain stats for how much is staked and who is staking it and what's going on in governance right now and on and on and on and on. We actually, the first version of that, because you want to be able to have fallbacks, like to be able to query that data directly from the chain if you need it. But two, we wanted to make sure that the contract interfaces during the development process were exposing the right data that would be needed. When the first version of that dashboard launched, doing all of that querying directly from the Ethereum blockchain, took on the order of 3 to 4 minutes to load. It's insane. There were all these fourth and fifth and sixth order questions, right, that had to be answered. It was like, get me all the list of services, and then now that I can loop through the services and ask, get me all the list of people delegating to that service, and then I could loop through all the people delegating and say, how much have they delegated? So it's like this horrible exponential blow up, right? As more people stake on the network, clearly it was going to get to a point where, it would take hours to load the dashboard and things would probably time out at that point. So the graph turned all of those queries into a single query. And that query, if it's not cached, takes on the order of a second to a couple of seconds to compute. If it is cached, it'll return in, sub 100 milliseconds, right? So it's quite a step function improvement to that. So that's just one way of using the graph, but it's a tool, right? It's like a hammer. There's a lot of different ways to use a hammer. I guess there are some wrong ways to use it, but it's probably there probably aren't that many wrong ways to use it, I guess. So yeah, it's just like it kind of like expands in your mind what are the things that I can solve with existing tools. That's how I describe it.
Episode 83.
And now Anne Conley and Chief Nimweya talking about the graph and their grant work in creating the graphic novel Trust.
Actually, I would make a small correction. We do have a small cameo of the graph in there. If you're very keen, there's an Easter egg that has a bit of the graph. But anyway, I think the graph is involved with Decentraland, is it not?
Yep, Decentraland is an application that uses the graph.
And one of the biggest use cases in Trust is the use of land titles and figuring out how we can get land titles on the blockchain. And I think something like Decentraland is a really good way to simulate that. And if it can work in that virtual setting, there's no great difference between, making it work there and making it work in real life. It's the same. You're dealing with information, you're dealing with ledgers. And the rest just becomes a political problem. What is really attractive to me, just seeing the missionary zeal that people have and the passion that people have. Of course, there's the speculative side and people wanting to make money. That will be there in every place that you look at. But there is also that real passion that people wanting to see a different way of doing things, people wanting to see a different world, a more decentralized world that brings power closer to individuals and doesn't abstract it away. And even when I listen to speakers at the Graph conferences speaking, that was very clear. People were aware of the political ramifications of what they were doing. And I found that very attractive.
One of the things that was so meaningful for me was that, this foundation was willing and very keen to support a project that didn't directly support themselves. It supported inclusion within the community. It supported education. It supported youth-focused content or, Black individuals in, I would say, underserved markets. And I mean, underserved by the crypto community. We're not hosting conferences there. We're not, pushing a lot of content that way. And so to see an organization recognize that, hey, this is not going to push out a bunch of tweets about the graph, or it's not going to bring on, new applications specifically to the graph, but it's going to support the quality of the community as a whole and the diversity of the community as a whole, was so meaningful for me. And really just, I think, sets an incredible example for other organizations across the sector.
Episode 84.
From episode 84, David Mihal, talking about when he first became aware of the graph.
Yeah, I mean, I've been aware of it for a while, just kind of from coming to hackathons and everything. But the first time I really started using it was when I built, the thing that I'm probably most known for these days is a website called cryptofees.info, which is a very simple little dashboard info site that shows fee revenue for various crypto protocols. And I first built that site back in like the early days of DeFi summer when DeFi was just starting to take off for the first time. Uniswap was starting to see a lot of volume flowing through. There were all these new tokens that you could only get in DeFi. You couldn't really get them on centralized exchanges yet. And people started talking that the amount of fee revenue that Uniswap was making was comparable to Bitcoin and Ethereum. And I threw together this really simple little website that kind of basically showed layer one blockchains, Bitcoin, Ethereum, other smaller chains like Bitcoin Cash and Ethereum Classic and Ripple and all these other chains. And it had Uniswap v1 and Uniswap v2. And for each of those, it showed how much fees are paid to that protocol in one day. So for blockchains, that's a transaction fee. And for Uniswap, for decentralized exchanges, that's a trading fee that goes to the liquidity provider. And so to build that site, I used a project called Coinmetrics to get like the Ethereum and the Bitcoin, those fees. But for Uniswap fees, I had to use this thing called a subgraph. So I was diving into the Uniswap subgraph and figuring out how to get the fee data from there. And then I shared this site on Twitter, and it got way bigger like response than I expected. People really interested in it, probably because I think it was one of the first like fundamentals based websites for DeFi and crypto. And as people were really excited about it, they kept saying, "Oh, can you add this protocol to it? Can you add synthetics? Can you add balancer?" And like, okay, like synthetics, they have a subgraph too. I can get the fee data from there, and I think balancer did as well. But at some point, I started running into protocols that didn't have a subgraph, or they had a subgraph but it didn't have their fee revenue data. So I was like, okay, now I gotta learn how to fetch this data myself, how to index this data. So that's kind of as I went down the rabbit hole of building subgraphs, just trying to like get data to feed into these sites, trying to get the data that people were asking me for. And, as a programmer, I just thought the idea of building these indexers was really fun and really elegant. And so I started enjoying it more and more and using it for projects outside of crypto fees and crypto stats. But yeah, that was my journey down the rabbit hole and into the graph ecosystem.
Episode 85.
During episode 85, we were joined by Tashi, co-founder and CEO at Playground Analytics. Here, Tashi applies his background as a systems engineer to evaluate the graph.
So I think the graph is a pretty elegant system with a clear output objective. It has well-defined subsystems and operators driving it, keeping its feedback loops tight, keeping the desired output reliably generating the correct data points that a user needs when it's queried. So, in the context of the graph, you can say, okay, what are the subsystems in this system? You have the consumers, you have the indexers, the curators, the delegators. The consumers are the ones paying for the queries. The indexers are the ones operating the nodes. The curators are using GRT to signal what subgraphs are valuable. You have the delegators who are putting the GRT at stake on behalf of the indexers for it to work. So this entire network has this beautiful, elegant, incentivized system where these actors, anyone, you can choose whatever you want to be in the network. All these actors are acting and working in unison, in harmony, to make sure that the desired state, which is a reliable API for users to query, would work at any point in time, no matter the day, time, where you are on the planet. If you want data from the blockchain and you use a subgraph API, the system will deliver. It's quite beautiful, honestly.
Episode 86.
Here's Chris Castig, co-founder at Console, talking about how important community is in Web3.
Yeah, I guess I'm getting a little stuck on the question because in some ways community is like, we need each other. We need to work with each other. Like in some ways it's like the evolution of open source is also what we're doing, right? If we're like all building Ethereum, which is what we're all doing, if you zoom out, or we're all building Bitcoin or whatever we're doing, we're all contributing to this thing. And in some ways, I'm part of the Ethereum ecosystem. I'm part of the Bitcoin ecosystem, and that's a community. I'm working on Console. I'm part of that community of, maybe 20 people at this point who are building that project. So I think, we need each other. And I think we need a shared vision for what Web3 can do for the world. And I think that's also why I'm just really passionate about the teaching work that I do, and or anyone who's teaching or writing about these topics in like a value-based, just a way that can be also more inclusive. I think that comes to mind for community. It's like we need a way to like bring more people in and like
make it so it's not just the same type of person, the same, we need to make it more broad and more inclusive of the rest of the world. And so, I don't know, this is just kind of a few random thoughts just on like, I think what community means for me. I think it's important, and I think we need to also expand that. And so I think that'll happen probably over the next decade. I think Web3 will become, we'll probably stop using that word and it'll just become something else. But I think it's going to be really, really fascinating to watch over the next decade.
Episode 87.
From episode 87, Nico Vergouwen, founder at Tenderize, a liquid staking solution for Web3, talking about how Tenderize uses the graph.
Yeah, definitely. I wouldn't be able to live without the graph and subgraphs, honestly. We use subgraphs for our protocol to index a lot of data that's actually shown in the app. And it's actually very data rich. We don't show a lot of information that's actually available in the application, but you could build a very large dashboard of the data that's in our subgraphs, actually. Because I remember the days that you didn't have a service like the graph. And if you wanted to index events, which is what the graph network does, it indexes events on the blockchain, you would have to do that on the user's machine itself, or on some centralized server. And you would have to write everything for that from scratch. And I remember working in my consulting job and each day refreshing the graph homepage to see when it would go live, because I was tired of always creating these kind of indexing services from scratch in the browser. So yeah, I've been a big fan of the graph, and we've been using it at LivePeer as one of the early launch partners as well. And then at the Tenderize as well, we use it heavily. So yeah, big user of the graph.
Episode 88.
Here's Eric Chen from episode 88, co-founder and CEO at Injective Labs. Here, Eric talks about how important the graph is for Injective.
Extremely important, because if you think about how a blockchain works, is that it only stores the most critical possible information on chain, and it gets rid of everything else that's not required for the next state or the state after that. And what you're basically missing is a wealth of historical data that are actionable, that are very, very useful in terms of informing the user, and sometimes informing the user of what has happened and what are they expecting to happen. And generally speaking, the indexing process are pretty streamlined for Ethereum virtual machine and for a lot of other virtual machine solutions alternative to EVM. But it's still extremely new for customized blockchains like Injective Network to really index those messages and making sure that it's presented to any developer or maybe even user front in an actionable and a clear way. So all in all, basically, the graph is probably the most important thing and the most unavoidable thing for a user to see for any type of application. Like even just going on the Explorer, you're interacting with the graph pretty intimately. Interacting with any type of application and so forth, you probably have to, interact with a graph database or, some form of an indexer to make sure that the information presented to you enables you to even use it. So yeah, I would say that it's probably the most important thing from application layer.
Episode 89.
During episode 89, we were joined by Christina Mills, Graph Advocate and member of Graph Advocates DAO. Here, Christina talks about what drew her to the Graph community.
Absolutely. People are really important to me. Genuine, good people who want to do something to make the world a better place. That's what drew me in. I listened to a lot of GRTiQ podcasts in the beginning, the one with Tegan, and it just became really clear that the people here are here for the right reasons. A truly decentralized system and making the world a better place, creating change in the world and empowering people to be the change. I was originally looking to gather technical information, and then I've entered this space with this wide open mindset and no real agenda other than just diversifying my skill set, learning something new. And I've just followed my intuition and taken chances and sometimes done things afraid. And I've just followed that path.
Episode 90.
Here's Paulo Diomede, Graph Advocate, member of Graph Advocates DAO, and admin with Graftronauts from episode 43. Here, Paulo talks about his vision for the graph and why he thinks it's so important for Web3.
Yeah, because basically the graph solves the most important problem in the software and the IT world, that is about retrieving data. So, I mean, if you think, for example, just, I don't know, if I think about my iPhone, for example, I have more than 2,000 contacts in my address book. I have also more than 200 nodes. So without the ability to search, I will get completely lost in my day-to-day life. And all the blockchain world relies on the fact that information is immutable, cannot be tampered, cannot be deleted. And this led to have an immense amount of information that is really hard to retrieve. And so basically the graph solves exactly this problem and is the only decentralized solution. That means there is no central power controlling the system. And without the graph, Web3 won't literally be able to take flight because we will get lost in this immense information, immense mare magnum of information.
Episode 91.
Suhail Kakar is a developer advocate at LivePeer and a very active content creator for devs in Web3. During episode 91, Suhail described why he thinks the graph is important for Web3.
Regarding Graph Protocol, I've been using it a ton for most of my Web3 applications. For those who don't know about Graph Protocol, it's an indexing rail of the Web3. Graph Protocol is one of the most important indexing protocol for organizing the blockchain, and also it is making it a lot easier to access the data using GraphQL. There are many subgraphs which users can use. For example, there's a subgraph for LivePeer, for Lens Protocol, for DeFi such as Uniswap, and many other. And also, since it's an open network, it is a very cheap, a very reliable way to access data for many crypto applications. And the best way is it supports many blockchains like Ethereum, Near, BNB, and many other.
Episode 92.
Noelle Becker Moreno with Edge and Node joined me for episode 92. Noelle's marketing lead at Edge and Node, and here she shares a story about how she moved into Web3, the graph, and went to work at Edge and Node.
Well, I told Tegan, hey, I'm going to talk to my old director, who I really respected, about going to Coinbase. Here I love design. I always thought this is all I was meant to do was design and own my own business. I love mentoring people. I loved running organization. I thought this is it. But then I just had this pull toward Web3. I couldn't unsee it. And so I told her, I was like, hey, I think I'm going to talk to my old director about Coinbase. And that's when she kind of sat me down. We talked about centralized and decentralized platform, the graph and Edge and Node, because we had really never dove really hard into the graph or Edge and Node prior to that. And then she set me up with a meeting with Yaniv at a coffee shop. And so we just talked about all these use cases, and really how this tech would even the playing field globally, where you would have merit-based opportunities. And no longer would it be who you know or what bloodline you came from. And right away, I said, there's a huge gap in educating the masses, right? People like me on this technology in this future, it's super intimidating. I want to help educate people. I want to tell my dad about this. I want to tell everybody about this, I want events all around the world. We meet and we connect. And I was really more interested in these, Web3 curious people. I really wanted to educate them and tell them hey, there's this different way. And Yaniv was already thinking about this. He's late years ahead. And so it began. And so essentially, Tegan's the one that got me into it and introduced me to change the world, to help the world. But I always say Yaniv had me at hello. So I say, Tegan introduced me to Web3 and that this technology was going to save the world. And we had to stay true to the mission.
Episode 93.
During episode 93, Colin O'Brien joined us with Rubric. Here, Colin talked about his own perspective about the graph and how it's important to Web3.
I'm glad you asked. Where would we be today without Google, without Yahoo, without the major search engines that we use to, query and parse through all the information that's available to us? It's a rhetorical question. We would not be very far. The internet would still be disjointed, and good information would be buried and inaccessible. when Tim Berners-Lee talked about his idea for the internet, it was a place where you could go to find any information and then at a later time go back and be able to find that same information again. So without something like that, without something like a search engine, a query and indexing system to be able to find things across the internet, it would not be possible to be where we are today. And I think the graph is going to represent that, but for Web3. So to be able to find data and find information spread across a multitude of blockchain networks, buried in applications, buried in websites, built on Web3, there needs to be a way to be able to access that information reliably and do so continuously into the future. And I think the graph is building something that is going to enable that, really kind of keep that important structure in place.
Episode 94.
From episode 94, here's Sergey Kunz, co-founder at 1inch Network, talking about the incredible backstory behind the origins of 1inch.
We had no idea, really. We had no idea. I was running around and pitching 1inch to everyone, how I did it normally. I was really bad in pitching, and also the judges, they didn't see any cool things on this implementation. But one guy said, this is the next big thing. This was Leon Horns, the organizer of ETH Global. He said, this is the next big thing. And I said, okay. We won just $300. I was able to pay for my airplane ticket. And weeks later, we recognized people start sharing the link to the app, and people start using it. And we thought, okay, then we need maybe a Twitter account. We set up a Twitter account, started to add new liquidity sources. So we were working 1.5 years for free. With working in the nights for 1inch, traveling around the globe, working on hackathons, on different other projects. We have built decentralized streaming platform, for example, in South Africa. Won also good prize for this, but we didn't continue to work on it because we have seen 1inch is something what's actually is useful for the user. We got good feedback from the community, and we grew up with the community. We didn't spend any penny for marketing or something in the first 1.5 years because we had no money at all. So we spent all time. I spent a lot of my time for 1inch. Yeah, our community helped us a lot. We got small amount of money from Gitcoin grants. It was also cool. One guy just sent us 50K. We were like, wow. How this? And actually it was mistake by this guy, but he didn't ask to get it back. We asked them to send him back because it was looking like mistake, and he said it's fine guys, it's a small investment from my side to you.
Episode 95.
Here's Alex Pakalniskas, Graph Advocate, member of Graph Advocates DAO, and member of Indexer DAO. Here, Alex talks about what drew him to the graph as he moved into Web3 from episode 95.
I guess for me, those projects and especially the graph really just align with my engineering interests and also broader aspirations for what software could be or tech could be. And I think that in my day-to-day job now and before, data is just super important, a unit of just knowledge, of importance, or of just computing. And so the graph is very much this data-centric protocol. And so I immediately just vibed with my personal kind of curiosities. And then seeing that it's open and it's all just open source, open data, that really jived with my just aspirations for a builder community that's really collaborative and open. And so I just saw this as a really cool opportunity to meet others that are into similar things. And I wasn't disappointed. But I think that just having aligned values with the project is really what kept me here. I mean, it's cool to see applied use cases, but I think I really nerd out on data, and it's been fun. So I think if you like data, the graph is an amazing project to check out as an onboarding into Web3. Not even that, just open source. I think if you're someone who's curious about open data and just technology, the graph is just a really amazing ecosystem of engineers, creators that you should check out, not limiting the audience to, those in the know. I think that's something that as a community, and now I'm speaking specifically about Web3 community, we really need to get better about talking to those that maybe don't even realize what Web3 is and seeing like where we overlap and where we don't and have that fun conversation. I think that so much of this technology is really interesting, but people are off put for whatever reason. And so meeting them halfway, whatever that is, just I think is really important. And I think that'll help us get to mainstream broad adoption faster than any code optimization. It's really like socializing this technology and getting people to see that it's people like us and not just nameless machines running it. Like at the end of the day, this is all still people driven. This technology, this community, it's just people running the computers for the distributed blockchain. Without the people, none of it would work. And so I think if you can somehow drive that home and see how this is a much more community-based technology than anything humanity has ever known, that can hopefully encourage people to give it a second look.
Thank you for listening to part 2 of the Best of 2022. Be sure to listen next week as we kick off the new year with a new episode of the GRTiQ podcast. In looking back on 2022, I think we can all agree that it was a monumental year, complete with new highs and new lows for the entire industry. But it's time to look ahead to 2023, which is already shaping up to be what could be the breakout year for Web3 and the graph. And we'll be here for all of it. So see you in 2023.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review. GRTiQ Podcast.